Um, this session is Can We Provide Vaccines for the World? We have a fantastic panel for you today of really some of the leading thinkers in the world who are involved in these issues. My name is Peggy Clark. I'm the Vice President of Policy Programs here at the Institute and the Executive Director of Global Health and Development. We're really pleased. We've seen a number of you come to our Global Health track, which is here at the Ideas Festival for the first time this year. So we feel like giving most valuable participant passes out because there's some of you who've come to all of our sessions, and we're very pleased. So it's my pleasure to introduce Lyndon Haviland, who is a nationally recognized expert in strategic communications for health. She was the COO of the Legacy Foundation and was very involved in the extraordinarily successful effort around public education around tobacco. She's our Aspen Senior Global Health Fellow, so I'm pleased to say she works with us on a number of issues that we work on at the Aspen Institute in Global Health. And she's also currently working with Secretary General Ban Ki-moon on his particular initiative on maternal and child health this year. So Lyndon, with that, thank you very much, and we look forward to hearing your questions, which we will save time for at the end of the session.
Thanks, Peggy. It's a pleasure to be here, and it's really exciting, actually, to be joined with this distinguished panel to talk about vaccines. I confess when and we're going to get to this, I confess when I was asked to do the panel on vaccines, I thought, what's new? I mean, there's nothing really exciting about vaccines. Little did I know. So these guys are going to excite you, educate you, and hopefully make you into the huge advocate that we need you to be to help us produce more vaccines and get them out to the world. So without further ado, what I want to do is thank them for joining me and thank Peggy and the Aspen Institute for giving us an opportunity to have this conversation. And I'm going to introduce each of the panelists. I confess I just introduced Chris, so I'm going to say it all over again, which is Chris Elias is a doctor. He is the president and CEO of PATH that operates in more than 70 countries. Chris has been recognized for his way of thinking. He is an innovative thinker about private-public partnerships. One of the things that we heard here at the Aspen Institute Ideas Festival is one of the reasons we don't have enough vaccines is the market incentives don't line up. The people who need vaccines are poor, they're not going to pay, and Chris is going to tell you why that's just flat out wrong. Chris has built his institution, he has quadrupled the budget, and while he's done that, he's gone from a smaller number of staff to a large staff, and he says the most important thing in any institution is the people, and so we couldn't agree with him more. Next to him is Jeff Sturgio. Jeff is 1 year, almost to the day, in his new job as the head of the Global Health Council. But he's not an immunologist, he's not a vaccine specialist, he's not even a doctor. So you might ask why he's here. He's actually the first ever, he's the first ever archivist for the Merck company. That was his first title, archivist. And he is a historian by training. And now he is the head of the Global Health Council, and he's going to help us understand what can we learn from history that we should pay attention to. And the man who probably needs no introduction, Dr. Seth Berkley. Seth and I have been traveling parallel paths for quite some time, but Seth is actually kind of an interesting character. I want to actually give you a little quote from him. It's a little frightening. Actually, he is the president and CEO of the International AIDS Vaccine Institute. He is a passionate believer. Each one of these guys is a passionate believer in vaccines. And he believes that in our lifetime, in very short order, we're going to see a vaccine for HIV and AIDS. And certainly, I hope he's right. He's worked all over the world. He actually, Francis Mothwa is here. Francis, Seth was the person who helped design the first AIDS surveillance system for Uganda. He has been at the forefront of the fight against HIV, and he's going to help us understand what the next frontier is. So with that set of introductions, I'm going to turn to our resident historian and archivist to help us set the floor. What vaccines are one of those rare things. They're kind of a silver bullet. And what Seth says is when a vaccine works, it's like a whisper. So tell us about vaccines and why should we care?
Well, I'll be glad to try, and I'll try not to bore you with all the details of history. I know a lot of people's eyes glaze over when you start to talk about it. I should add also I have some experience in global health. So but we'll see.
Just a little. No, he also ran the Merck Foundation and has been really a leader in corporate social responsibility. And Merck is one of the companies that really has pushed the envelope in corporate social responsibility, making commitments, holding those commitments even when it wasn't good in the marketplace. And so Merck is often held up as an excellent example of corporate citizenship.
So, vaccines are really one of the most successful public health interventions in history. And most of what's happened in terms of improving coverage and discovery of new vaccines that are dealing with some of the diseases that were the biggest killers has happened in our lifetimes. So what we're really seeing is a tremendous acceleration both of the invention of new vaccines and the distribution of those vaccines to the people in need. I'll just give 4 or 5 quick points to set the stage for us. In the last 35 years, we've really seen tremendous increase in coverage of immunization around the world. And the point that I'll start with is the expanded program of immunization that the WHO led beginning in 1974. And at that time, for diseases like diphtheria, pertussis or whooping cough, tetanus, and measles, as well as polio and TB, the coverage in most developing countries around the world was less than 5%. Now, 36 years later, as a result of the work that began with the EPI in 1974, we find on average that coverage is about 80%. So it's been a tremendous increase. And as a result of that work, we see really changes that have had tremendous social, economic, and also political consequences as a result of that introduction of immunization. I'll give just 3 examples. Let me start with smallpox. Smallpox was actually eradicated in 1979 through a very ambitious and ultimately successful partnership of many public health agencies and governments and NGOs all over the world, as well as the scientific and medical communities. But that was a disease that had killed literally tens of millions of people over thousands of years. It's now no longer a public health problem in any way. Measles, let's take that as an example. Deaths from measles now have declined by 75% in just the last 20 years or so. There's still too many, but that's significantly less. It's about 200,000 a year now. And polio, there's also a global polio eradication initiative, which has gone in the last 20 years from 1,000 infections a day around the world to less than 5 infections a day. So there's been almost a 99% decrease in the incidence of polio. And in fact, there are only 4 regions in 4 countries, regions of 4 countries, Afghanistan, Pakistan, Nigeria, and India, where polio is still a public health problem. So finally, just to wind the clock closer to the present, in 2000, the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization was created. That was one of the first major investments of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, where they provided $750 million to help the Gavi Alliance get off the ground. And what that did was enable, there had been a plateau in the increase in coverage of immunization, and the Gavi Alliance really provided new momentum to immunization, the immunization movement. They've focused on the 72 poorest countries around the world and have also made a focus of trying to get new vaccines to people as well. Because one of the challenges, and Chris and Seth can say more about this, is that some of the newer vaccines that have been introduced, take a vaccine against hepatitis B, which was first introduced in the West in 1982. It took nearly 20 years for that vaccine to reach developing countries, even though the incidence of hepatitis B was probably worst in some of those countries like China. And now, with the work that the Gavi Alliance has done, if you look at a new vaccine like the rotavirus vaccines that were introduced a couple of years ago, the same year that they were made available in Europe and the United States, they were also available in countries in Central America and elsewhere in the developing world. So that's just one other indication of the progress that we've seen. In the last 20 years, as a result of all of this work, more than 20 million children's lives have been saved. And now there are probably about 2.5 million children's lives saved in developing countries every year from the basic vaccines against diphtheria, pertussis, tetanus, and measles. So that's just tremendous progress as a result of this global partnership. Just one thing, though, that I know we'll spend more time on in the rest of the session is that there's still a lot more work to do, because there are probably still more than 2 million children who die every year of vaccine-preventable illnesses who don't yet have access to these vaccines. And just to put that in context, that means that in the time that we're here for this session, more than 300 children will die of a vaccine-preventable illness.
Thanks, Jeff. Seth, he mentioned new vaccines, trends in vaccine science. You're at the forefront of that, and one article I saw that quoted you, you said, "The science is breathtaking." So take our breath away.
Well, let me start and go back a little bit to what Jeff said, and then I'll move into new vaccines. And what's extraordinary is that people don't value vaccines. That's why the whisper is an important, issue. So most people here don't worry about smallpox. They don't have to worry about smallpox. Yet last century, 500 million people died of that disease. Now, my wife, who's sitting in the front row as a physician, she's never seen a case of measles. She's never seen a case of tetanus. These are terrifying and horrible diseases. And one of the problems we have is because people aren't afraid of these diseases anymore, they become afraid of vaccines and the rare side effects. People are going without vaccines, having their children go without vaccines. And what we're beginning to see is the immunity that exists across the population. It can be logical to do that. If you have 100 children going to school and 99 of them get immunized against a disease, you don't have to immunize your child because that child's not going to get it because it's not going to spread. But when it gets down to 90 or 85 or 80, then you have enough susceptibles that the diseases can spread. And we're seeing right now diseases like pertussis taking off in California. We're seeing outbreaks of measles in the UK, around the world. So I hope we come back to that because this denialism is a huge problem of the amazing things that have happened with existing vaccines. Vaccines, for a while were a terrible business. They were, there was huge liability risks associated with it. They were commodities. They were really cheap. The 6 vaccines that Jeff just talked about cost less than $1. And so industry wasn't investing a lot of money in it. In fact, we had a huge consolidation of vaccine producers in the United States and around the world. What's happened since then is there's been a turnaround. There's been insurance schemes for liability, and there have now been some billion-dollar vaccines. And this is the hottest area in the pharmaceutical sector. A number of large companies, actually, best-performing units are in vaccines. The combination of that and the amazing advances that have occurred in biological sciences have allowed us now to come up with really breathtaking new ways to approach vaccinations. And this is both for new diseases like HIV. Malaria isn't a new disease, but new technologies are being used on it, but also for old vaccines. And hopefully we'll talk a little bit, for example, about flu, which the current vaccine that you all got was made in 1938. It's a terrible technology. It's a good vaccine. It's a terrible technology. Using new technologies, though, we can make that vaccine much faster, much cheaper, and make it around the world. And that's what we need to do. So I suspect you want me to say something about HIV. What's interesting is that HIV is the most difficult, perhaps, of all pathogens that we've had to deal with, and for lots of reasons. It's a retrovirus. It has to go backwards in its process of reproduction, and it has all kinds of errors. So there's a lot of mutagenesis. There's a lot of different strains that are out there. Each person makes 1 billion new strains a day when they're infected with it. So big problem with variability, but also a big problem because the virus itself coats itself with sugars, makes it hard for the immune system to see. And what's happened over the last period of time, this last year, is we've had the first vaccine that has shown effect in humans, albeit a modest effect. And as importantly, people have discovered antibodies that neutralize all the strains of HIV. And if you saw the Wall Street Journal on Thursday, it was another announcement of these, and with those new targets. So what we've got now for HIV is fabulous targets to go after with an understanding that they are conserved and that these are things we can go, produce vaccines for. So stay tuned. We're going to see a lot of exciting science.
Great. But where science hits the road is sometimes in the places where PATH works. PATH works in over 70 countries. You have offices, you have staff all over the world, and you often sit at the intersection of civil society interaction with the private sector and with government. So tell us a little bit about what the role for each of the different players is, both in vaccine production and then in developing the systems to get it out. And if you have time, could you also tell us how do we create a demand for vaccines? I mean, we're pushing them out, but how do we actually develop a demand so that there is a ready audience waiting for these new vaccinations?
Maybe just to take off on a point that Seth made, he talked about how in the last decade we've seen a couple of blockbuster vaccine sales. I think we have to realize that those sales, the HPV vaccine, the pneumococcal conjugate vaccine, are blockbusters because there are markets for them in this country. There's another class of vaccines for which are really only needed in poor countries, and like malaria, regional vaccines for Japanese encephalitis and meningitis A, where the market fails, where the companies don't have sufficient incentive to invest their R&D efforts. And the approach is somewhat different depending on which one you're taking. So on HPV, for instance, we, the global public sector, didn't have to...
Explain HPV.
Human papillomavirus, which is the virus that causes cervical cancer. We didn't have to invest in the development of that vaccine because there was a big market for that vaccine in rich countries. Companies developed it on their own. They're marketing and selling it in the U.S. and Europe and Japan, and they're making quite good profits. But then they realized that 85% of the disease burden from cervical cancer is actually in the poor countries, and so they're partnering with us on figuring out how to introduce that vaccine in the developing world. For other vaccines, those like malaria and meningitis, really the development has to be done through public-private partnerships. We learned, I think, historically, that if the public sector tries to do it itself in an academic laboratory or national laboratory, it can sometimes get done, but it takes years. So the innovation of the last decade or so has been to use public sector resources and leadership in partnership with companies to harness their innovation capability to these neglected diseases, and by sharing the costs and reducing the risks, we can incent them to participate in the discovery of these new vaccines. For those vaccines that are needed in poor countries, demand generation isn't the biggest problem, right? So if you go to the 21 countries of the African meningitis belt, where they have annual epidemics of meningitis, which is an inflammation of the covering of the brain, that in a bad season affect 1 in 1,000 people under the age of 30. If you go there and say, we can develop a vaccine for this, they say there'll be no problem for people to take that up, because it disrupts, not only does it kill 10 or 20% of the people who get it and cause deafness and other neurological sequelae in many of the others, but it actually shuts down the health system in places like Burkina Faso for 2 or 3 months a year as they chase the epidemic. So the demand isn't as big of a problem. It's really about how do we form the right partnerships to as quickly as possible, develop these vaccines, because the market's going to fail. So even though in the multinational pharmaceutical industry, the vaccine business has become a much better part of their business, that's only for the vaccines that actually have a market in the West. For the places where the vaccines are really only needed, malaria, 40% of the world's population lives in areas with malaria transmission, but they're the poorest 40% of the population, and the companies just aren't going to do it on their own.
Jeff, let's talk about companies. You, in your distinguished career at Merck, you were at the forefront of looking at these opportunities for straight philanthropy, opportunities for partnership, and the opportunities for independent research and development. From your perspective, in the current status of vaccines, what would you say to companies about the future as described by Chris?
Well, it's this is an interesting set of questions, because I think that I agree with most of what Chris said, but I think there's another way of looking at the discussions around market failure, because what you might say is that that's market failure seen from the perspective of us in developed country markets. But I think what's interesting, and what we've seen over the last 10 or 15 years in particular, is that there are companies developing in emerging markets themselves that are beginning to take on some of the burden of at least manufacturing and distributing these vaccines. We'll come back to the question of R&D. But for instance, there's a network of developing country vaccine manufacturers with about 20 companies in places like India, China, Brazil, and Korea, who are now supplying 3/5 of the vaccines that are used around the developing world, and in fact 1/3 of the vaccines that the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization purchased a couple of years ago. So the picture's already changing. It's not just the big five. There's one thing that some of you may be aware of, is that there really are only 5 multinational vaccine manufacturers of any consequence in the world. That's Merck, Sanofi, Pasteur, GlaxoSmithKline, Pfizer, which just recently bought Wyeth, which had been one of the major manufacturers up to then, and Novartis. So it's those 5 companies in the developed world, and then you have this emerging network of other companies that are getting engaged in vaccines. So one of the questions that I think that major pharmaceutical companies who are in this space should be asking, as well as the companies in emerging markets who are already seeing the opportunity, is what will the world look like 20 or 30 years from now, and what will the markets look like 20 or 30 years from now? So it's certainly true, as Chris was suggesting, if we tried to approach this challenge of discovering, developing, and delivering the vaccines that are going to be needed by the world's population 20 or 30 years from now, the way that we've approached it up until now, it would not be a pretty picture, and we'd still have tremendous gaps. But if we start thinking about ways of distributing the manufacturing, distributing the R&D, distributing it to the places where people really need it the most, and to think of new ways of solving those problems so that you don't have the kind of overhead that a global manufacturer has, but you can operate still providing high-quality vaccines, but doing it in a way that costs much less and is much more flexible and adaptable, I think you'll have a different response. And then one last point, because I want to come back to the big companies, which is the sort of environment I know best. One of the other things that's been happening recently is that most of the major pharma companies, and the 5 that I mentioned are certainly fall in this category, are beginning to realize that the markets that they could depend on in the past, in the United States and Western Europe and Japan, are no longer going to provide the growth that they've always depended on. And if you look at the Economist Intelligence Unit or any other number of other studies that have been done, 15 years from now, the growth is going to be, will continue to be in places like China and India and Brazil and Russia and Korea and Turkey. And, these are markets that the pharmaceutical industry really wasn't engaged in very much 20 years ago. And this has come up in a number of the sessions here. I mean, we heard this morning in the session with David Rubenstein and David Hale and Alan Greenspan, most of them were talking about China and India as where they're going to be putting their money. And the same thing's true of major pharmaceutical manufacturers. So what we haven't seen yet is the practical outcome of that shift in sort of vision of what the future of the industry looks like and where the future opportunities are. So I'm actually optimistic that the market failures we'd seen in the past are not likely to continue to be there, not just because pharmaceutical companies are going to start looking at these other countries as major markets, but because of the ingenuity of the people who are already in those markets, who we've already begun to see are taking advantage of those opportunities.
If I can just jump in. So one of the interesting questions is, how do you deal with the incentives around that? Most of the innovation these days, not as true in vaccines, but certainly in drugs and more in vaccines, is in smaller companies, in biotech companies. And how do we get them to focus on diseases of the developing world? And even if you were to leap, I mean, it's counterintuitive, but you go to India and you look at a company there and say, what do they want to focus on? They're going to focus on diseases of the West, and they're going to focus on trying to create products that can be used in the West or in their middle class to upper class populations, because they're the paying ones. So there's not a natural incentive for them to look at diseases of poverty either. So what you need are new mechanisms for incentives. One is thinking about a worldwide approach. In the past, we've had a mindset that said, let's look at high pay, low volume as a business model, as opposed to trying to have very high volume, low margins, and you can shift that mindset. The other is beginning to create innovative financial features. And so a few years ago, a concept was floated of creating an advanced purchase mechanism. Initially, the talk was to use it for something like HIV, where you could argue we put incentives in place to engage industry. People felt that was a little scary. It was perhaps too long a timeline. You wouldn't prove that it worked. They ended up using it for pneumococcal disease, which was something that people knew it was coming down the pike and knew how to do it. And the way they set it up is they put a large pot of money out there that could then subsidize the purchase of it at the beginning, so that manufacturers would make their money back up front. And in trade for that, they would guarantee a low price going out. And by creating that type of mechanism, you take the balloon of profit that companies would normally get, you give it up front, you give some certainty, thinking of innovative ways like that to engage on diseases of poverty or on vaccines that are needed in places that don't have natural markets, but over time may create enough of a market, enough of profitability to make it more worthwhile, are the types of innovations we need, not just in science but in policy.
Bill Gates has announced that this is the decade of vaccine, and he's putting 10 billion beside it. So, Chris, what are we going to see in this decade of the vaccine?
I think we're going to see a breathtaking science, as Seth said, and a lot of new products that are designed appropriately for some of the important diseases of the poorest countries. And so maybe just to build on Jeff's and Seth's comments, I agree with Jeff that there's a growing interest among the multinationals in the emerging markets. That will lead them to target some diseases they might not have historically that are prevalent in those middle-income countries. We see Sanofi doing that with dengue fever. But for diseases that are in the poor countries, it's going to be a long time before they get there. So, and so one of the things we've done at PATH is to use a public-private partnership model, harnessing that innovation capability of these emerging countries in India and China, where they're interested. I think you're right, Seth. In the long term, they're going to be interested in products for Western markets where they can make bigger margins. But right now, they're interested in doing creative public-private partnerships to build their capacity, because they don't have the installed R&D base of the multinationals. So, for instance, we did a project over the last 9 years to develop a low-cost meningitis vaccine for those 21 countries in the African meningitis belt. The hyperendemic countries are Niger, Chad, Burkina Faso, Mali, northern Nigeria. Average GDP is $250 per person per year, less than $1 a day. So we started, and this was funded, partnership of the World Health Organization and PATH, funded by the Gates Foundation. Our first step was to ask the public health officials in those countries, if we could develop a vaccine, what would it need to look like? And they said, the only thing worse than not having a vaccine against this terrible disease would be to have a vaccine and not be able to afford it. So we think that in mass immunizations, we need to be able to have a vaccine that costs less than 50 cents a dose. Because in Burkina Faso, the health budget is $6 per person per year. So they were willing to put a 12th of their health budget to buy this vaccine. But they said if it's $3, we won't be able to afford it. So we then went to the multinationals, and most of them said they weren't interested. One said they could. The best they could do was $4 a dose, because they didn't want to have to redo the factory. We hired a bunch of retired industry people who said, if you optimize the process and use the lowest cost ingredients, you theoretically could make this vaccine at 19 cents a dose. And so it was theoretically possible, but none of the multinationals wanted to do it at that price because it would have required redoing factories and that. So we went to the Serum Institute of India, which actually makes 70% of the world's measles vaccine now, and did a public-private partnership with them where we transferred the technology. We licensed the intellectual property out of the NIH, sub-licensed it to the Serum Institute of India, provided all the technical assistance for the technology transfer, and in our agreement, they guaranteed to produce at least 25 million doses a year at a guaranteed price of 40 cents a dose. And that vaccine was approved by the Indian Regulatory Authority in just January, and just 2 weeks ago was pre-qualified by the World Health Organization, which clears the way for its introduction this September. We're going to introduce 28 million doses in Mali, Niger, and Burkina Faso this September, 3 months after the vaccine was approved. So goodbye to the 20-year delay, but you need that kind of creative partnership. They were interested. They're going to make a profit even at 40 cents a dose, but they didn't have the installed R&D capability, so they needed the public-private partnership. They needed the funding provided by the Gates Foundation, the support provided by the WHO and PATH to be able to develop that vaccine. Now, 10 years from now, they're going to have that capability, and that's where we've got to fix these incentives so that they're not then using that capability to make cancer drugs for Chicago. They're still working on diseases that are important in poor countries.
Great. I'm going to remind people that we do have microphones, and we're going to turn to the microphones shortly. But Seth, you work on an AIDS vaccine, and you are working in 25 countries. given what he just said about R&D capacity, building local capacity, the future, tell me what comes to mind when you're thinking about all of those in terms of both the AIDS vaccine and what's next?
Well, I mean, I agree with Chris. It's critical to use local capacity. And so if you ask how these new innovations have occurred, it's been a really interesting process. It's required really good science at the country level. It's required scientists around the world to engage, the best scientists. It's also required engaging companies. And as Chris has said, we work in the public-private partnership model. And for us, it wasn't only engaging companies that were the likely suspects. We had to go out and create a new mechanism to go after companies that were not working in the HIV vaccine space. And the reason is that we needed to break through technologically. We needed to take ideas that were in cancer, to take ideas that were in antibody production, and bring those to the problem. Now, each one of those sound like simple solutions, but putting them all together in real time to make this happen is really where the innovation is. It's these new creative networks of innovation that Chris has talked about. And so right now we're working with companies in Japan who have vaccines and companies in the Netherlands. We're working across Africa with scientists who are doing important work. We have a laboratory in India that's doing modeling of these antibodies and medicinal chemistry. Why India? Because India had a lot of medicinal chemists, because for a long time their business was reverse engineering things so they could get around patents and make medicines. They can't do that anymore now that they're part of the new trade system. So we said, well, why don't we go back and use some of these people? It's this type of innovation that needs to occur. And I absolutely agree with Chris, because there is a hunger in those places to say, how can we make the technological leaps? Of course, if you go to a company in the United States and look at who's actually working in those companies, it's mostly the diaspora from India and China and other places, and they're on their way back. And so we're seeing a real transition time that's occurring now that we hope to take advantage of.
Jeff, what you look like you want to jump right in there.
Yeah,
So
no, I was just thinking, to go back to how you introduced me as an historian. I tend to look at these trends in what's really new and what conclusions can we draw from this. It strikes me as interesting that what Seth and Chris have been talking about is really one of the benefits of globalization, because these partnership networks would be impossible if we weren't able to have the kind of ready mobility of people between India and the U.S. or between China and the U.S. and going back and forth. If there weren't the ability to tap into information that's developed elsewhere and put to use, put it to use in places like Niger and else, the other countries that are affected by meningitis. So, that's a real innovation in the way that vaccine discovery, development, and distribution has been done in the last 30 years. These partnerships among public and private agencies is really an important innovation in organization of global health activities, and it's one that's here to stay. I think that we'll no longer see the kind of world in which, for instance, 50 years ago, when the first vaccines against measles, for instance, the first successful ones were introduced entirely in one company and from start to finish. That's unlikely to happen anymore, because there's just too much knowledge and interest in all of these institutions. So working together, the whole clearly adds up to more than the sum of the parts.
But there is a downside, and the downside with those networks is the misinformation that flows. And that is one of the scariest things of working in vaccines. We might have had polio eradicated by now, if not for misinformation about polio vaccines that had some communities stop vaccinating, and then epidemics that spread. And of course, today you can have breakfast in Nairobi, lunch in London, and dinner in New York, and that's faster than the incubation time of these diseases. So diseases can spread very quickly, and the anti-vaccine movement is very scary indeed, because it's very hard to fight back when the information sources are blogs, on the internet, and there's no countervailing information.
we're going to go to a question, but then I'm going to ask you all to also, you talked about the anti-vaccine movement, and we sometimes see religion and people talking about their freedom not to be vaccinated, and we see some very emotional arguments made. So I'm going to want you all to comment on that, but first I'm going to turn to our first questioner.
Well, I agree that the emotional part of the anti-vaccine is important. I don't want to be preempting that discussion. But my question is more on technology. I've been reading recently about a different approach to vaccination that seems to me might transform just the technology of how we develop and deliver them. And it has to do with DNA-based vaccines, where essentially you create a DNA molecule that represents whatever protein you want the body to make. It's injected in the body makes the vaccine. And therefore, you bypass a lot of the work that we've had to do up to now. And I'm curious about what the opinion of the panelists is. Is that kind of technology also going to help here in the next 10 years, or is that something that's still too futuristic?
Great, and we'll take the second question, and then we'll let the panel respond.
Congratulations on your work worldwide. If I can ask you a more local question. SARS never got so off the ground in the bird flu in the United States, but I remember thinking that we were extremely vulnerable had it, because there didn't seem to be enough antibiotics around. And I was told that the drug companies didn't want to do it because it wasn't profitable enough and the shelf life isn't long enough. But how is it possible that in this country, where government is supposed to protect the population, we're not doing anything about it? And can you influence that and help that?
On DNA vaccines, you know, it's a very exciting technology. If we were mice, one, we would never get cancer, and two, DNA vaccines would work very well. They've worked much better in the animal models, and best in mice, less good in primates, and the least good in humans. Now, there are a lot of techniques to try to make those better. People are using adjuvants, chemicals that can increase the power of those. People are beginning to ask, can you put them in nanoparticles? And if you do that, you change the way the immune system looks at it. People are using other types of viruses and ways to stimulate them. So I don't think that we see that dead, but they have not led to the promise you described, which is an easy way to move forward. And it really goes to a little bit to the second question, which is what we need are vaccines that you can have a technique that is worked out, that we know is safe, that you can basically drop a cassette in. And in a way, that's what traditional flu vaccines are. Every year is a new strain. We put the strain in as I said, a vaccine technology from 1938. And if we could do that and have those approved ahead of time, then when new diseases appeared, we'd have the opportunity to be able to move it forward. And I think this is where technology is going to take us. And all I can say is stay tuned, because there's a lot of exciting new technology that's moving forward in that area.
Yeah, I'd say to the DNA vaccine question, in many of our portfolios, we have 7 different portfolios of vaccine development on different targets. We're certainly looking at DNA vaccines. It's true that the mice lie a lot, so that it's hard to know. And in most of those diseases, there are further advanced technologies that we're more certain will work, but we'll certainly keep working on the DNA vaccines. I think especially as some of these delivery nanoparticles and that come along, there may be some breakthroughs there, but it's hard to know until it breaks through. I think the issue around flu, I mean, there's a couple of issues. One is around the drugs, and maybe, Jeff, since you were in a drug company, you can speak to that. The vaccine piece of flu is interesting because we're very ill prepared for a serious pandemic for a variety of reasons, but one of which is a limitation in our production capability for flu vaccines. There are 6.7 billion people on the planet, and I think the global capacity for production of flu vaccines is somewhere south of 1 billion. So one of the things we're working on in our flu vaccine program is novel production technologies that could be, things like a disposable vaccine factory that could be transferred to the places, closer to the places where they need to be produced. To develop, using current practices, current production practices, and current regulatory standards, to develop and qualify a new flu production factory takes about 5 years to bring a new factory on. And it's hard, the companies aren't going to make those investments for a theoretical possibility of a pandemic flu. One of the things we could do is actually increase our use of the seasonal flu vaccine. So a shocking number of Americans, I forget the figures, maybe somebody else will remember them. Most people don't get the seasonal flu vaccine. It's a safe, effective vaccine, and it'll we have 30,000 people who die from seasonal flu every year, and we underutilize that vaccine. If we used the seasonal flu vaccine more, that would provide the commercial incentive to build and sustain greater production capacity. But until that happens, it's going to be very hard to, and you can't really build a factory and not use it. until you need it, because then you've got to ramp it up. You got to do the quality assurance, So building up our, perhaps coming up with better production facilities and more easily scalable and transferable facilities, that's probably the longer-term solution. But in the meantime, actually using the vaccine we have for seasonal flu now so that we create the right business model for a greater global production. Because, last year had the H1N1 vaccine, which was so easily transmitted, had the lethality of the H5N1 avian vaccine, we would have had a global pandemic of crisis proportions, and we would have had very little vaccine that would have left the rich countries to go to the poor countries who would have had most of the mortality.
None. I mean, in essence, when the flu season hit, basically nobody in the developing world was vaccinated. And the problem is, that the current vaccine is made in eggs. And if, by the way, the avian flu was to kill the birds as part of that made the eggs, you would have a problem. And the particular flu, the H1N1 for last year, it took about a 0.8 of a dose per egg is what was produced. So think about that population of 6 billion and what it was like. And Chris is right. There just hasn't been the investments in new technologies, even though they exist. But they will come. It's just going to take some time.
Lori?
Hi. I have two questions, if the moderator will allow, or I'll pick one. Lori Garrett.
Lob us your two, and we'll see what we do.
Okay. The first question goes to flu and is really a national security question. We cannot make enough vaccine now for flu for the whole world. And at some distant point in the future, we probably will have technology that will make it possible to make 9 billion doses for all of humanity. But we don't now, and many years are going to pass before we get there. And in the meantime, countries are saying, well, then why should we share viral samples with drug companies and with WHO if you're going to make a vaccine out of it that we will never get, or that we're umpteenth on the list to get? President Obama tried to short-circuit that by announcing that 10% of the U.S. vaccine supply during this last flu round would be distributed globally, but it didn't actually go into distribution until basically everybody knew the epidemic was over. So it was just getting rid of garbage. How do we get through this dangerous period? It may be 5 years long, it may be 20 years long, where we do not possibly have equity of access. We have looming threat. Bird flu ain't going away, and it continues to mutate. But we have great global tension around this. My second question is kind of similar, but it has to do with the drug industry. So you're telling us that the hope for the future is these new models of drug production and vaccine production coming out of places like India, possibly Thailand, China. We know the list. And meanwhile, the giant pharmaceutical industry as we know it continues to be a darling of the stock market, to the surprise of everybody who knows anything about the industry, because the industry is falling to pieces, completely falling to pieces. And here again, we have this possibility of a unknown length of years before this transition to some new model of pharmaceutical production will occur. How can we make it through this potentially very difficult time when we may not even have vaccine and drug in production for the rich world, much less for the poor?
Well, thanks, Lori. So I'm going to turn to our drug company ex-representative and ask him to take the first crack.
No, well, those as always, those are both very perceptive questions from Lori, and they're not easy to answer. I think, I can't presume to speak on behalf of the pharmaceutical industry, but I can just give you my personal opinion on what's going to happen. I don't think actually the industry is completely falling to pieces. Although, when you look at certain companies at certain times, you might get that impression. It's still largely a profitable industry. And what I think is going to happen, and the reason that I spent some time earlier talking about the transition in the global pharmaceutical market, is that the industry, although it takes a long time to move, and someone in a session earlier today likened it to the Titanic or a battleship trying to turn, eventually there is movement. And I think what's different now than when you had the first wave of mergers about 30 years ago in the industry, or at least the first wave in my experience, is that you now have markets like China and India, which are becoming competitors to the traditional multinationals. So that just changes the landscape in a way that we don't yet know how it's going to turn out. But as I said earlier, I'm optimistic that it's likely to lead to interesting and very constructive new business models. So what will happen is that if we depend only on large pharmaceutical companies to solve the problems that you alluded to, we're in trouble. But because of the new competitors, because of all the kind of work that Seth and Chris have been talking about, there is just a lot of interesting things going on that are going to be successful in ways that traditional pharmaceutical business models aren't going to be successful. And people being smart will pick up on that. Investment will begin to flow to those new examples. And I think that you'll see a new equilibrium around ways in which we'll have more of the vaccines and medicines that we need for a larger part of the world's population. Back to the first question, I think that the answer to that is going to lie in the same direction that I was just talking about, and I'm sure Chris and Seth have things to add here too. But for instance, if you look at the argument that Indonesia made about sharing virus samples, it's a reasonable question to ask. Why should we share them if we're not going to have any of the benefit of the vaccines that come from them? But the solution that the Obama administration came up with, well, we'll put aside 10% of our production and make sure that that's available globally, just begs the question, because then you have to ask, well, who gets the 10%? So what the question back to Indonesia and other countries like that should be, well, why don't we be glad to work with you to develop capacity in your country to manufacture these vaccines? And there are now, as I alluded to earlier, there are manufacturers who can provide that kind of technology transfer, some of whom are already in the countries that are going to be most directly affected by these epidemics. And I think a solution that takes all of the resources and assets that we have globally into account is more likely to lead to success than the way that we've been trying to go about this for decades. So those are a couple of my thoughts.
Thanks, Jeff. Seth, when Lori teed up the question, she noted flu as a potential national security threat. You also work in HIV, which, given the epidemic rates in many countries in Africa, is also certainly a security threat. So can you talk a little bit about the national situation with flu, but also kind of take it to the next level and talk about why vaccine development is so important, and why, if diseases like these spread, it really does threaten the future of peace and justice?
Well, to go back to Lori's question, which is a great one, first of all, I think Indonesia is asking exactly the right question. The problem has been we have the technologies now to be able to make flu vaccine in larger quantities and faster. But when the panic occurred around avian flu, and then the question was, what do we do about manufacturing capability? People went back to egg-based because it's what they knew. They built the large plants, and now with the reason we have other diseases like that is because they're moving around. So from now on, it is beware the country that thinks it itself can deal with these problems. We have to think of them in a new global way, and of course, Lori's been one of the great writers in bringing this to the world's attention.
Sophie?
Good afternoon. If you allow me, I have one comment and a question. The comment is about measles that was presented in the previous session on global health and a few minutes ago as a major success. It's been a success, but I would like to highlight the fact that in recent months, we faced major outbreaks of measles in Malawi, in Burkina Faso, in Chad at the moment. And it's not just about, a bad coverage, but it's also about the efficiency of the vaccine that is available at the moment in these countries. So together with meningitis and rotavirus and pneumococcal, there is definitely a need for a better measles vaccine. And my question is about, of course, bringing down the cost of vaccine. So you've presented some alternatives, some options, like decreasing the cost of research and development, but also the advanced market commitments. But we've learned through the fight against HIV/AIDS that generic competition was also, one of the best ways to bring down the cost. And recently in the health bill, there was a provision that was passed almost unnoticed that allowed greater exclusivity, 12-year exclusivity on biologics. So what I would like to know is, what's your position on this provision? And do you think that in the field of vaccine, there is also a potential for generic competition? And how does it go? It's so incompatible. If you believe it's possible, then this provision is going to be a major barrier to better access to these vaccines.
Great, thank you. Chris?
Yeah, I think that our experience shows that competition helps to drive down prices in the vaccine markets like it does in other markets. And the challenge is that from an intellectual property point of view in vaccines, the patent, unlike drugs, the patents are much less important, as the core intellectual property is more the know-how, the process development, the things that are much harder to transfer. What we've been doing, part of our programs, and I mentioned we have several different vaccine development portfolios, there are now licensed pneumococcal and rotavirus vaccines. We're working on lower cost versions of those with Indian and Chinese and Brazilian manufacturers. It's not exactly analogous to the generics competition in the drugs market that we've seen help bring down prices in ARVs so effectively, but it's similar. So we're basically working with, and one of the things, so let me just give you a little detail about our rotavirus project. The NIH developed a rotavirus vaccine approach that's similar to and looks to be just as effective as the approach that the two companies that are currently marketing rotavirus vaccines have. They've given 6 non-exclusive licenses to 6 different companies. We're creating what we call an enabling platform, basically a set of tools that will help all 6 of those licensees of the NIH strain of the rotavirus vaccine to be successful. It involves formulation expertise, packaging expertise, cell culture banks, basically a set of enabling tools that will help the holders of that non-exclusive intellectual property succeed. And we're basically making it available to all 6 of them and hoping that they'll compete to produce effective vaccines at reasonable costs. We're also working with 2 of those 6 companies, one in India, one in China, in a more intensive public-private partnership similar to what I described with meningitis to help accelerate and ensure their success. So I think the general idea that competition and lower cost production of the technologies will help to produce more affordable products is correct. Whether it will require the same types of intellectual property arrangements as we've seen with drugs, I think it has to be modified. So the way we think about the intellectual property is that it's a tool to an end. And in some cases, just putting it in the public domain, other cases, keeping it protected and then licensing it in a strategic way. So it varies a little bit vaccine by vaccine, but the general idea that we need more manufacturers, particularly in emerging countries, that can produce at lower cost and therefore be able to sell at lower prices is one that we would support.
I'll just add 2 quick points to that. One is that the good news is that there are a network of emerging manufacturers who can do the kind of work that Chris is talking about here, and I think that's a terrific example of how you can bring those enabling technologies to enable them to do a much better job. The other thing I just wanted to add, and this gets back to Lori's point about how the multinational pharmaceutical industry is having its challenges these days. One of the best assets that I think is available to help in increasing manufacturing in emerging markets and developing countries are the tens of thousands of engineers and scientists who are leaving the multinational pharmaceutical industry. In fact, I've come across in recent weeks someone who was an engineer at my old company who's now gone off and set up his own company to do manufacturing in developing countries. And just as Chris said earlier that some of the people you talked to at the big companies said you could get the price down to 19 cents. That's exactly what he's trying to do, is to take things that he was working on in his earlier life and now doing the things that can bring the price down. And there's also a group of chemical engineers and chemists who I met through the American Chemical Society, who had left the pharmaceutical industry and are now spending all of their time trying to improve the prospects for drug production at high quality and low cost in Africa. So I think that's, there hasn't been that much attention to that, but I think it's an interesting development that we'll see more
Just
of.
add one last point, and Sophie, for me, IP is, as Chris said, is a tool. I think what we have to do is use advocacy to change the mindset. And the idea that a life-saving vaccine would be brought out and made available in one country and the rest of the world ignored should never be allowed again. And I would have thought that we had gotten there after HIV, but you know, HPV appeared and there hadn't been the rollout plans, the ideas, the way to extend it out, and that's happening now, but it's happening a number of years later. And I think what we have to do is change that mindset, and when we do that, and we think about it, then there can be ways to get it out to other manufacturers. There can be ways to have different pricing scales. And so it can be done with a respect of IP, but it has to get out to the people who need it.
Great, thank you. We'll take our last two questions. Francis first, and then... Oh, yeah, and I'll ask them to make their closing remarks on that.
Yes, just to follow on all these discussions. During 2009, I was the chair of the Independent Review Commission of Gavi, reviewing applications from countries for these vaccines. A lot of applications, especially for Rota and pneumo. I am told by Gavi now that they have no money to provide those vaccines, for which we worked very hard to recommend funding. And the committee which I chaired has virtually been closed because Gavi doesn't have money to fund approved applications. How do we deal with that?
Oh, you want me to go ahead? Okay, hi, I'm Carol Edelman from the Hudson Institute, and I publish an Index of Global Philanthropy where we do a lot of writing on health programs as well. My question is this issue of substandard and counterfeit drugs, which is can be as high as 30, 40, even in some countries, although there are not enough studies on it, as high as 50%. And yet, when you talk to people inside the World Bank and WHO, you hear some real horror stories of procurements that they've had come in with no documentation and no bioequivalence tests or anything. But it seems to me, I feel like in vaccines, you have done a wonderful job. I mean, and I just wanted to ask, how have you done it? I mean, what kinds of quality control have you put in? And is there a chance that the rising tide will, raise the other boats in non-vaccines? And maybe there's some great lessons learned there.
Yeah, well, I can start off, maybe with to Francis's comment. I mean, I think you highlight a very important problem, which is that the Global Alliance for Vaccines and Immunization has a $2.6 billion shortfall. Now, and they're out there actively raising funds to meet that shortfall. The good news is that at the recent board meeting 3 weeks ago, they did lift the pause on funding the approved IRC supported applications. They did, because they are short of funds, put in place what is an understandable but unfortunate restriction, which is that they've now told countries that they can only apply for one new vaccine at a time. And as you know, to rationally plan an immunization program, you want a 5-year plan, you want to size your cold chain and your procurement logistics to all the vaccines you're going to put in. So it's it's not going to be easy for health systems to deal with that restriction, although the restriction is put in because they want to be able to fund more countries and not, so it reflects their shortfall of funding. Personally, I think the way we can help mobilize resources for Gavi is to use what would be a modest investment of Gavi resources to help roll out the meningitis vaccine in West Africa, because it's a limited number of countries, it's a guaranteed 40 cents a dose, and it can be done in mass immunizations. What Gavi needs is a demonstrable success. If they deliver that vaccine and next year there's no seasonal epidemic of meningitis, they will have the success story and the support of the African leadership they will need to go convince donors to give them, to replenish their coffers. So I think that's one approach, but that's certainly one we're advocating with them. The issue on supply chains, it has been less of a problem for counterfeiting because most of the way that poor countries, that counterfeiting drugs is most common in the poorest countries, and the poorest countries generally get their vaccines through the UNICEF supply system and the warehouse in Copenhagen, which aggregates demand and does large tenders to drive prices down. That's being done in drugs through the Global Fund and others on more of a regional basis, and it is a model to emulate. The bigger challenge in vaccines is that they're so perishable and the cold chain requirements and that, which is also facilitated by having UNICEF do that aggregated procurement.
Seth, you're an emotional guy. We know this. And when we talked yesterday, we talked a little bit about the emotional backlash and the challenge of talking with someone who is absolutely convinced that you are trying to export autism to the world because you're a proponent of vaccination. So what do we say to that?
Well, first of all, you have to be unbelievably sympathetic to parents who have to deal with an autistic child. And, it's a terrible thing. And, of course, the thing any parent asks, I would ask, is what did I do wrong? And the problem is children get immunizations a lot along their childhood. And if a child, for example, was struck by lightning, and you collected all the children that got struck by lightning, a certain number of them would have had vaccines within 48 hours of that strike. And of course, people wouldn't make that connection, but the autism connection has been made and now is being pushed through by generation after generation of people. Yet studies have shown over and over that there is no connection. And so the problem is how do you get people to believe data and science in this? And it goes back to the issue I talked about before of the problem of misinformation that exists out there. If you go and click on the web and look for vaccine information, one of the first sites you'll come to is a site that is very well designed and looks like all the other sites that are providing information, but is coming out of the group of parents who are concerned about these safety issues on vaccines. And this is where we've also had problems with the issues of trust in governance and international institutions because, again, you have governments doing the studies and certifying them. And so I think the real challenge is to get people to rethink. And as long as we live in a world where people don't remember what disease was like without vaccines, we live in that threat. And you'd hate to see, that to come back. But when people do have those outbreaks, when like right now, people are saying, well, we dodged the flu epidemic. Next time, they shouldn't declare it an epidemic. They shouldn't make such a big deal about it. And as Nathan said on the last panel, they only had to dial up the lethalness of the particular flu a little bit, and we would have had people clamoring on how come the governments were so slow, how come they didn't make enough vaccines, how come they didn't. So I think it's really a matter of balancing those issues.
And perhaps balancing public perception and nimble strategic communications that can be trusted from trusted sources. So please join me in thanking this lovely panel. Thank you.
Thanks.